All right, let's take a look at the Cincinnati Bengals and see what did they do during the 2018 offseason, both in free agency and the draft. Did they make their team better from last season? Well, first let's look at their cap situation. How much money did they have to work with? Well, in mid-February of 2018, the beginning of the offseason, they had about $36 million. Is a pretty good chunk of change. And then at the beginning of August, they still had $16.5 million left. So that's not bad. Actually, it's one of the higher amounts of any team in the league. It's not the most, but it's definitely in the top half. So $16.5 million, not bad. They might choose to roll much of that over into future years, or maybe they'll see a guy that might become available sometime late in the preseason, a cut, and say, hey, we need to pick that guy up. So right now they've got some money to work with. Let's look at some of the players who at the beginning of the preseason I thought might be at risk of getting cut. And let's see what happened to them. Well, Adam Jones was a guy that I definitely had on my radar that I thought was at risk of getting cut. He was injured and played poorly last season. He's going to turn 35 next season. And the Bengals were able to save $5.7 million by cutting him. So that was kind of a no-brainer, to cut him rather than pay Pac-Man Jones $5.7 million. Especially when the Bengals have Dre Kirkpatrick, William Jackson III, and Darqueze Dennard. So the Bengals already have three really, really good corners. There was no reason to bring Pac-Man Jones back at $5.7 million, so he won't be back next season. And that was the only guy that I had sort of had on my radar that was a big risk of getting cut. Let's look at the offensive unrestricted free agents, the guys that could sign with any team. A.J. McCarron, he won his arbitration in the offseason. The Bengals had argued that he should be a restricted free agent, but he successfully argued that he should be an unrestricted free agent. It had to do with whether or not he deserved to get credit for one of his seasons. I think it was his rookie season where the Bengals sat him out. And he was arguing that he could have played, and so he ended up getting credit for that season. And you can see here his numbers. He was picked in 2014, and in 2015 he actually played in 7 games. But most of his stats from those games came in 4 games. He started 4 games, and then he, played a few snaps in 3 other games. But he had 854 yards, 6 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 66% completion percentage. Those are, it's a small sample size, 4 games. I know it says 7, but like I said, most of those stats came from 4 games. 4 games is not a huge sample size, but those are pretty decent numbers. 3-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio, 66% completion, about 200 yards a game. It's pretty good. Not bad for a former 5th-round pick in his 2nd year. And he ended up getting a 2-year, $10 million deal from Buffalo, which is really backup quarterback money, but there are also playing time incentives so that if he ends up becoming the starter, he's eligible to get, maybe another $6 million in compensation. So A.J. McCarron really lucked out to, win that arbitration and to become an unrestricted free agent. But it's very unlucky in a way for the Bengals because they were hoping he'll be back for at least another year as the backup to Dalton. So let's look at who else were free agents on the offense. Tyler Eifert was a free agent. He has played in more than half the games in just 2 of his 5 seasons. 2 times he played in 2 games or less. So he has missed a lot of games, and in fact, he's missed over half of his games. He had a good rookie year. He had a good third year before he got injured again. But he has just really battled with injuries. He's had 2 back surgeries in 2 years. And the Bengals elected to bring him back for 1 year and $5.5 million. So we'll see. If he stays healthy, the guy is a force. He's a great player who really is hard to cover. He's hard for linebackers and safeties to cover. He's a really, really good receiver. But can he stay healthy? And the truth is that the answer up until this point has more often than not been no. So this is a really important season for Tyler Eifert, and he is really lucky, in my opinion, that he was able to get $5.5 million. I know he put up great numbers when he was healthy, but he just hadn't been healthy much. Jeremy Hill is another guy who was a free agent. I feel really bad for Jeremy Hill. I really do. His rookie season, boom, 1,100 yards. The next 2 years, he had 794 and then 839 yards. His yards per carry weren't as good, but he still produced, you know what I mean? And then he's in the final year of his rookie contract. The rookie contract is not for a huge amount of money. And then what happens, he ends up getting 116 yards in 7 games and only 3.1 yards per carry. In fact, he even missed the final 8 games with an ankle injury. It was a disaster for him. And he was in a tough situation to begin with because the Bengals had paid Bernard during the offseason and then drafted Mixon. So, the writing was kind of on the wall for him to begin with, but to then have that kind of year in his contract year, it was a disaster. The Patriots end up signing him to a 1-year, $1.5 million deal, but it's not a guarantee that he's going to make the roster. They got Rex Burkhead, they got James White, Mike Gillislee, Sony Michel. Burkhead just signed a contract. They just drafted Michel in the first round, so he's going to be fighting it out with Gillislee and James White for that third spot. And I don't know. I mean, maybe they'll carry 4 running backs, but Jeremy Hill is not in a great situation. Russell Bodine is another guy who contributed last year, who is a free agent. He finished his rookie contract after being drafted in the 4th round, but he's a guy who really had his ups and downs. Honestly, he didn't play that well. He really didn't. But Marvin Lewis liked him and, gave him lots of opportunities, but they had to let him walk. Well, they didn't have to, but they chose to. He got a 2-year, $5 million deal with Buffalo. He's just... last year, he was not a starting caliber center. Andre Smith was also a free agent. He was the swing tackle last year. He started quite a few games at right tackle, and he played in 13 games total. He was playing on a 1-year, $3.25 million deal. He's not young. He's 31 years old at this point. But he was able to sign a 2-year, $8 million deal with Arizona. So he'll, I guess, get a chance to compete for a starting job in Arizona, or at least be the swing tackle there. What guys on defense were free agents, unrestricted free agents? Chris Smith was an unrestricted free agent. You can see his numbers had a very good season. Not very, but a good season. You know, after struggling through some injuries, or at least not playing in many games in Jacksonville, he comes over to Cincinnati last season, plays all 16 games, gets 26 tackles and 3 sacks. A solid backup defensive lineman. And after finishing his 4th year, he was able to get a 3-year, $12 million deal with Cleveland. So, not bad. You know, he was able to get a nice raise. $4 million a year. Good for Chris Smith, but you know, the Bengals will have to replace that production. At defensive tackle, you have Pat Sims. You can see his numbers dropped this year. I mean, he's 32 years old. So he had 37 tackles in 2016 and 25 tackles last season. His tackles for losses also dropped. And maybe it's time, you know, for the Bengals to give the 4th rounder Andrew Billings, a former 4th rounder in 2016, time to give him a bigger role. And that's probably what's going to happen. You know, but Pat Sims was only paid $1 million last season, so he's not a huge burden, but it's just a question of, you know, would they be better off letting Andrew Billings play more? And that's probably what they're going to do. Kevin Minter was a guy who they brought in last season. He had really good numbers the 2 previous seasons with the Cardinals. You see there 94 tackles, 10 tackles for a loss, then 81 tackles the next year with 3.5 sacks and 6 tackles for a loss. But he ended up not doing that well for the Bengals. All right. He had signed a 1-year, $4.25 million deal to start at middle linebacker, but ended up, you know, on the IR with a hamstring injury. It was the worst year of his career since his rookie year in 2013. I didn't show those numbers here, but you know, it was the worst year he'd had since his rookie season. And you can see that showed because the best deal he was able to find, it seems, was an $880,000 deal with the Jets. So, you know, after having a bad year last year with the Bengals, he ended up having to take a huge pay cut from $4.25 million to $880,000. That's what happens when you don't perform and you have injuries. Let's summarize all of the major changes on the Bengals roster. First, out A.J. McCarron. He was a solid backup quarterback, but he'll be competing for the starting job there in Buffalo. Who's going to replace him as the backup? Matt Barkley. So Matt Barkley is in, and they also drafted Logan Woodside in the 7th round. But they'll be competing to back up Andy Dalton. At running back, Jeremy Hill is out. He had a great rookie season, but had been dropping off as of late. Last year did not have a good year at all. And in comes Mark Walton in the 4th round. So, you know, the starter is going to be obviously Joe Mixon, and then, you know, he'll split carries with Bernard, and Mark Walton will be the number 3 guy there in Cincinnati. At wide receiver, they drafted Alden Tate in the 7th round. So not a huge change there on the wide receiver group. At tackle, Andre Smith is out. He had started many games in place of Jake Fisher, who was injured. In comes Cordy Glenn and Bobby Hart. So the Bengals traded back in the draft in order to get Cordy Glenn. Cordy Glenn is coming off of a foot injury. He only played in half the games the last 2 seasons. And 2019 and 2020 are team options. So what that means is that they don't lose, any money if they cut him. They can just not exercise the option. So really they traded back in the draft in order to get a guy who used to be, basically a Pro Bowl caliber left tackle, in hopes that he'll be healthy and will return to play at the level that he did before. And if he doesn't, they traded back in the draft, which is a disappointment, but they didn't lose their first round pick. They just traded back, and then they can let him go, and there won't be any financial consequence for them. So we'll see how that pans out. Something to keep an eye on if you're a Bengals fan. If Cordy Glenn can return to the level he played at before, that'll be really, really useful. That'll help the Bengals offensive line a lot, and God, do they need it. Okay, their line was a mess last year. Bobby Hart is being brought over as well. He didn't play that well last year, though, and so, he signed a 1-year, $1 million deal. That is not somebody, you don't sign a tackle for 1 year and $1 million, expecting that he's going to start. This is like your number 4 option. At center and guard, Russell Bodine is out. He was the starting center last year, but honestly, he didn't play that well. Eric Winston is out. He was a backup guard. And they brought in Billy Price in the first round. That is an upgrade almost for sure. So that's good. So, if Cordy Glenn can play well at left tackle, and then Billy Price comes in as a rookie and performs like a lot of people expect him to, he didn't get drafted in the first round for no reason, that will really help the Bengals offensive line a lot. It's a big question mark with Cordy Glenn, but if he can be healthy and return to form, that will help the Bengals a lot. They also drafted Rod Taylor in the 7th round to provide some depth at guard. At defensive end, Chris Smith is out. We showed his numbers earlier: 26 tackles, 3 sacks. Really good numbers for a backup, and they decided to draft Sam Hubbard in the 3rd round, hoping that maybe he can, take some of those snaps that Chris Smith had last year. At defensive tackle, Pat Sims is out, but Chris Baker is in. You can see Pat Sims was 32 last season and had 25 tackles. Chris Baker will be 31 this next season, but he had pretty good numbers with Tampa Bay. 33 tackles, not bad, in a backup role. He was kind of the number 2 or number 3 defensive tackle there in Tampa. And they gave him a 1-year, $3 million deal. A little bit more expensive than Pat Sims, but he's got a little bit more left in the tank than Pat Sims too. So that's an upgrade. Andrew Brown, 5th round pick. They also got him to come in and provide some depth at defensive tackle. At linebacker, Kevin Minter is gone. They had a lot higher hopes for him when they signed him for $4.5 million, but they didn't pan out at all. So they brought in Preston Brown, who is the starter for the Bills last season. You can see his numbers there. He led the NFL in tackles last season, but he's not very good in coverage. So, signing Preston Brown is probably, an upgrade over Kevin Minter last season, for sure. But at the same time, he's probably not going to be making the Pro Bowl, because in today's NFL, you got to be able to cover running backs and maybe sometimes tight ends, and that's not really a strength for Preston Brown. But he's an upgrade over what Kevin Minter gave last season. And then they also drafted Malik Jefferson in the 3rd round. he's a guy who is, a bit raw, but has a ton of talent. He's a physical freak. So if they can coach him up, that's a good long-term, guy at linebacker. So at linebacker, the Bengals probably upgraded a little bit, just like they did at defensive tackle. At cornerback, Adam Jones is gone. But they drafted a couple of guys in the 5th round, Devontae Harris and Darius Phillips. So I don't know. In the short term, I don't think that is an upgrade over Adam Jones, but these are guys that, aren't probably going to be competing and contributing that much right away anyway, because the Bengals already have 3 very good corners on the roster. So, they're kind of developmental guys, and they'll see if one of these guys can, develop into a really strong player. And this is one of the big free agent signings, is Jesse Bates III, 2nd round free safety. The Bengals also had 2 pretty good safeties on the roster too, but they just decided, I guess, that Jesse Bates was too good to pass up and would really be a good option, for the long term. So if you look at the Bengals roster, I would say their defense, this is a loss to lose Chris Smith, but overall I'd say their defense probably was upgraded slightly. Mainly because probably Preston Brown. But a lot of these other guys are more backup players that provide depth this year. Chris Baker will play too. But overall, I'd say their defense improved a little bit. Their offensive line probably will improve as well. But other than that, there's nobody on offense that they brought in that is going to dramatically improve the offense. So that's kind of what you should be expecting if you're a Bengals fan. But, if the offensive line improves, their whole offense could improve. So that is the good news. And then their defense will be marginally better. The Bengals look like a team that might be able to compete for a playoff spot. Should be able to compete for a playoff spot if things go well. I'm not saying they should definitely win it, but they should definitely be in the playoff race. But they don't look like a team that has improved enough from last season to be able to compete with New England, Jacksonville, or Pittsburgh. They just don't. So that's what you're looking at if you're a Bengals fan, at least from my opinion. If you like this video, please click subscribe, because we are going to have some great videos in the upcoming weeks and months. At the end of the preseason, we are going to break down the final rosters of all 32 teams. And then each week, we're going to have a video to preview all of the upcoming week's games, as well as a video to review all of the previous week's games. So we are going to have some of the best coverage of the NFL on YouTube. So make sure you click subscribe so that you can check out our videos that are coming up in the future. Thank you so much.